In the winter of 2019, every machinery counter in Pawnee County, Kansas, was telling the same story about broken parts. The story sounded different depending on where you heard it. At the dealership it sounded like model numbers, serial breaks, and freight estimates. At the co-op it sounded like efficiency, standardization, and the kind of mild contempt modern systems reserve for anything repaired twice. At the machine shed doors of younger operators it sounded like progress. Why keep bent housings, worn sprockets, odd shafts, stripped castings, cracked covers, salvaged couplers, and coffee cans full of bolts that came off machines nobody even ran anymore? Why keep shelves of broken things when the catalog existed, when the factory still stamped new parts, when tomorrow could always be ordered by phone before noon? In that county, if a man saved broken parts, people assumed one of two things. Either he was too poor to do things correctly or too stubborn to understand that agriculture had already moved past his kind of caution. One of the men they said that about was a farmer named Leon Dwyer. Leon was 68 that winter and built the way certain prairie men are built when time has taken weight off them but not strength. He had a narrow frame, a permanent squint from 40 years of sun off sheet metal and wheat stubble, and hands with old burns on the backs of them from welding jobs done before proper gloves were common. He did not speak much in public unless a question involved iron, weather, or dishonesty, and then he spoke plainly enough to make better-dressed men uncomfortable. His farm sat 5 miles east of Burdett on ground his father had rented before owning, and if you drove in through the lane the first thing you saw beyond the house and fuel tank was a long low shed that local people referred to, with varying degrees of kindness, as Leon's junk chapel. It was not junk, at least not to Leon. Inside that shed were rows of parts cleaned, tagged, stacked, and sorted with a discipline few people had ever bothered to notice because few people had ever bothered to walk all the way in. There were planter drive chains soaking in oil, row unit arms from machines long scrapped, cleaned bearings stored with the better used ones wrapped in wax paper, seed meter housings in milk crates marked by model and year, hydraulic couplers, cast hubs, lift assist pivots, opener discs with enough life left for emergency, finger pickup components, closing wheel brackets, idlers, gauge wheel arms, half a dozen transmission cases from old drills, sprocket sets wired together in matching pairs. And on one whole wall a line of pegboard holding every odd bolt, spring, pin, washer, and clamp Leon had ever thought might one day stand between a field and disaster. People laughed because order makes salvage look more serious than they want it to look. The co-op manager, a cheerful man named Russ Hovel who had the smooth confidence of somebody never forced to finish planting with improvised hardware, once told a group over coffee that Leon was running a museum for bad decisions. Another farmer, younger, expanding fast, and always talking about uptime as if he had invented it, said saving broken parts was a depression habit with no business model. Even Leon's nephew Matt, who helped on the farm and respected his uncle more than he admitted aloud, sometimes asked why all of it needed to be kept when the same space could hold cleaner things. Leon would usually answer the same way. Because broken isn't the same as useless. Then he would go back to whatever he was repairing and leave the sentence there, as if the world had already been offered all the explanation it deserved. Now, if you want to understand what happened later, you have to understand how Leon had become that kind of man. He had not been born collecting failed parts out of romance. Scarcity trained him. In the 1980s, when interest rates could turn one bad month into a family referendum, he learned what it meant to keep equipment moving with whatever a farm and a welder could produce. In the 1990s, when manufacturers began changing model lines faster than local memory could keep pace, he noticed how quickly obsolete became a sales strategy rather than a technical fact. By the 2000s he had developed a private rule. If a part failed in a way that revealed its geometry, mating surfaces, stress points, or salvageable sections, it was worth keeping. Not because it could always be reused whole. Often it could not. But because a failed part still carried information. It showed where metal had worn, where load had traveled, what thickness mattered, what alignment could not be faked, what bolt pattern a factory engineer had once thought obvious and a local dealer would one day pretend was impossible to match without buying new everything. Leon kept failures because failures taught him how machines actually wanted to live. The machine line at the center of this story was a series of no-till planters built by a regional factory in Missouri that most farmers in central Kansas trusted because they had become the default middle path between expensive prestige iron and older units patched into service one season at a time. By 2019, more than half the larger operators in Pawnee County were running some version of those row units. They were not perfect. No machine line is. But they were available, familiar, and supported by parts channels people assumed would remain permanent because permanence is one of the fantasies smooth distribution systems teach. The factory made opener arm castings, depth adjust pivots, drive coupler housings, transmission brackets, seed meter mounts, and 100 other modest components nobody thinks about until one cracks on a Tuesday in April. And because the factory had been there for decades, people treated its continued existence like weather. Annoying sometimes, expensive often, but as fixed as gravity. Leon owned one of those planters too, though his was older than most and had been bought used out of Stafford County after a flood sale. He liked the toolbar, distrusted some of the cast components, and had already rebuilt the machine far enough to know which areas would one day become trouble. Over the years he had collected failed pieces off neighbor scrap piles, auction rows, and dealer cleanouts whenever he could buy them cheap enough to justify the trip. A cracked arm could be sectioned and used as a welding jig. A wallowed-out pivot housing could be line bored and bushed if the surrounding material was still honest. A stripped transmission case might still yield shafts, gears, or cover plates no one could source in a hurry. He did not advertise any of this. He simply kept collecting, cleaning, and learning. That winter, while men in town were talking about variable rate maps and bean basis, Leon was in his salvage shed with a heater humming near his knees, rebuilding 2-row unit carrier pivots off an abandoned 12-row bought for scrap. Matt stood beside him one afternoon holding a flashlight while Leon checked fit against an old pin. "You know Russ says you could clear 20 years of junk out of here and never miss a thing," Matt said. Leon kept working. "Russ says a lot of things from a heated office." Matt grinned. "He ain't wrong about all of it." Leon slid the pin through, felt the drag, pulled it back out, and held the housing toward the light. "You ever notice the people who laugh at spare parts are the ones who don't have to find them in April?" That answer stayed with Matt because it did not sound defensive. It sounded like fact. The spring of 2020 came early, then sideways. March opened with warm days and the kind of dry wind that makes wheat country act impatient. Shops filled. Planters came out. The co-op loaded fertilizer from dawn until evening. Parts counters ran steady, and the ordinary choreography of planting season took over the county. If a bearing failed, it could be run to town. If a bracket cracked, a new one could be in by afternoon. If a row unit tore something loose, the machine would be down only long enough for someone to complain about modern quality and put on the replacement. That was how everybody expected the season to work because that was how the system had trained them to think. Even when a part was unavailable locally, the factory was there. The line was there. The trucks were there. Somewhere, somebody was stamping tomorrow. Then, on April 11th, the factory closed. Not gradually. Not with a public sequence of warnings county people had time to absorb and translate into preparation. It closed without warning after an ownership dispute, a financing seizure, and a shutdown that began as a rumor and by noon became a reality. The phone still rang. The website still existed for a little while. The local dealers still repeated phrases like temporary interruption and should be resolved soon. But by the next morning freight had stopped, inventory access had locked up, and every farmer whose planting plan relied on that machinery line was living inside the kind of truth modern agriculture is built to keep out of sight. A supply chain is only invisible until it breaks, and once it breaks everybody can suddenly see how much of their confidence was made elsewhere. At first the county did not panic. Rural people are too practiced in denial to panic early. They complained. They speculated. They told themselves most breakdowns could still be covered from dealer stock. Russ Havel at the co-op said something would be worked out. A dealership salesman 2 towns over told a group of growers that corporate restructurings looked worse than they were and nobody should overreact. But the problem with planting season is that it does not wait politely while men offer reassurance. Parts began failing in real time. Housings cracked. Closing system pivots broke. Transmission covers split. Meter mounts loosened and shattered where they had been stressed for years. And when operators called for replacements, the answer that came back was the one answer modern farming hates more than high prices. Unavailable. It started with little things. A gauge wheel arm here. A drive coupler there. Annoying. Then the larger failures came. By the 3rd week of April, 2 major operators south of Burdett had planters sitting idle over broken cast brackets they could not source. A custom operator near Rosal had a seed meter mount fail on 6 rows and spent 2 days calling 3 states worth of dealers only to discover everybody else was doing the same thing. Men who had once mocked Leon's salvage shed were now driving county roads asking if anyone knew anyone who might still have old units, broken units, donor units, anything. Leon did not enjoy this. That is important. He took no pleasure in being proved right by other people's trouble. He had farmed too long to enjoy another man's breakdown in planting season. But neither did he pretend surprise. When the first call came, from a neighbor named Jared Phelps whose 16-row had lost an opener pivot casting, Leon listened quietly, asked which revision the planter carried, then walked into the shed, went to the 3rd bay, and pulled a tagged housing off the 2nd shelf from the floor. Jared arrived 40 minutes later, saw the part in Leon's hand, and just stared. "Where in the world did you get that?" Leon said, "From a planter everyone else said was scrap." Jared turned the casting over, checked the ears, the boss thickness, the mounting face. "This'll fit?" "It'll fit if you rebush it like I told you and stop running your row cleaners so hard they hammer the whole assembly." Jared laughed once, but it was the laugh of a man already grateful. He asked what Leon wanted for it. Leon named a number so low Jared looked embarrassed. Then Leon added, "Bring me your broken one after season. I want it." By the end of that week, 3 more farmers had come. One needed a transmission cover. Leon had one from a junked drill drive assembly that required drilling 1 oil passage and swapping a shaft seal. Another needed a seed meter mounting frame. Leon had a cracked one, but he also had a jig made from an older failed mount and enough experience with nickel rod to weld the good side of the casting and reinforce it with a steel saddle plate no factory engineer would have endorsed and no planter in the county would have refused. A 3rd man needed a closing system bracket everyone had already declared impossible to find. Leon had 2. 1 whole and 1 broken. He cut the broken one apart, used the straight section to patch the worn whole one where years of load had thinned it, then handed it over with a warning to keep an eye on parallel arm alignment. Matt watched all this with the expression of a man realizing that what had once looked like hoarding was actually infrastructure. The county's tone changed fast. Russ Havel at the co-op, who had once called Leon's shed a museum, now called asking whether Leon had any spare seed meter housings for a customer stranded 12 miles south of Garfield. Leon said he might. Russ came out himself, walked into the shed, and for the first time in his life actually looked at the place rather than joking about it from the doorway. The shelves were labeled by model family and stress type. Broken castings were separated from salvageable machined parts. Hardware bins were tagged by thread, shoulder length, and common application. Leon even had sections of old chain kept only because the offset links were no longer easy to source locally. Russ stood there a long moment, then said, "I thought this was all junk." Leon shrugged. "Factory thought so too, probably. That line went through town in a day." But the real proof arrived not in talk, but in acreage. Planting season in central Kansas is not generous with downtime. One missed day can be tolerated. Two can be explained. A week begins turning confidence into arithmetic. The operators who found Leon early kept moving. Jared Phelps lost half a day. The custom operator near Rosal lost less than 2. Another farmer with a cracked drive coupler was back in the field by dark after Leon dug through a crate of failed housings, found one with a salvageable flange, and showed the farmer exactly where to add a support strap so the repaired piece would hold long enough to finish beans. Meanwhile, other men who waited on the dealer system, or trusted rumors that the factory would restart any day now, sat still. Their planters lined the edges of fields like grounded aircraft. Seed sat in boxes. Weather windows narrowed. The county began dividing itself into 2 groups, those who still believed order could be delivered and those driving to Leon's place with broken metal on truck beds. Some brought embarrassment with them. One of them was Brett Simons, the same younger operator who had once said saving broken parts was a depression habit with no business model. Brett farmed a lot of acres, ran newer equipment than Leon ever had, and carried himself with the efficient impatience of somebody who had never yet been forced to admit a dependency he could not buy his way out of. His planter came in on a flatbed after a cast transmission support cracked in 2 places and twisted enough to throw the drive system out of line. The dealer had none. The regional warehouse had none. 3 states' worth of phone calls produced nothing. He came to Leon because someone at the co-op finally told him what everyone already knew. If anybody in the county could get him moving, it was the old man with the junk shed. Brett climbed down from the truck, looked at the broken support, looked at Leon, and tried to begin with dignity. "Heard you might have something close." Leon squatted beside the part without answering. He studied the fracture, the bolt pattern, the wall thickness. Then he stood up and said, "I don't have that exact casting. I've got the older version and one broken newer one." Brett waited. Leon continued. "Older version won't bolt straight up without a spacer and one line rerouted. Broken newer one still has the good ear. I can make one good support out of both if you can stay out of my way for 3 hours." Brett said, "Whatever it takes." Leon wiped his hands on a rag and looked at him properly for the first time. "That true now? Because when I was saving these, you said it was junk." Brett reddened, but to his credit he did not hide. "Looks like I was wrong." Leon nodded once. "Good. Easier to work with the truth." The repair took 4 hours, not 3. Leon cut the usable ear from the broken newer support, machined the mating surface, gusseted the older body where he knew load liked to travel, and built a spacer arrangement that kept alignment honest enough for season work. Matt drilled. Brett held parts when told. Nobody spoke more than necessary. When the planter left at dusk, it was not pretty. The paint was scorched at one weld. The gusset looked homemade because it was. But it ran. Brett planted with it for the rest of the season and later admitted it held better than the factory original. By then the factory still had not reopened. What nobody had understood in early April was how fast a shutdown becomes permanent once financing, ownership, and tooling all begin drifting into separate legal darkness. Dealer inventories dried up. Secondary markets emptied. Auction sites got stripped clean. Farmers who had once counted on overnight freight were suddenly learning the old, humiliating vocabulary of scarcity. Adapt. Borrow. Remachine. Reverse engineer. Cannibalize. Salvage. It was as if the county had been pushed backward through time without warning, only now with more acres to cover and less practice doing without. Leon became a quiet crossroads. He did not start a business. He did not make a flyer. He did not raise prices just because he could have. That was not his way. He helped where he could, traded where it made sense, bought back broken cores whenever possible, and rebuilt what could still be taught to serve. His farm work kept going too. That is another part people forget in these stories. The man at the center still has his own acres, his own weather, his own breakdowns. Leon planted his own crops between rescue jobs, often working by yard lights after supper while Matt organized salvage bins and wrote down who owed what part back after season. They rebuilt opener arms with bushings turned out of stock Leon had saved from an old irrigation pivot repair. They fitted older style bearings into newer housings by machining sleeves. They used cracked meter mounts as patterns to plasma-cut reinforcement plates from scrap steel. They salvaged good gears from seized transmissions, welded up worn slots, and turned eccentric washers to take slack out of assemblies other men had been taught could only be replaced whole. Every job made the same point more clearly. The county had spent 10 years mocking the habit of keeping broken parts because the county had spent 10 easy years believing factories are forever. Then the factory closed without warning, and suddenly broken parts were the only bridge many men had left. The weather helped the lesson stick. Spring windows stayed narrow. A storm line in early May shut everybody down for 2 days, then left just enough moisture that the next planting run mattered desperately. The farmers Leon helped caught that window. The ones who were still waiting on dealer promises often did not. Acreage differences began showing up before emergence. Fields planted on time and into proper moisture stood evenly. Fields planted late into compromised conditions looked, in places, like apology. You could have drawn a map of the county based on who had access to salvage intelligence and who had trusted the old system 1 week too long. Even the co-op changed. Russ Hovell stopped joking about junk. In June he asked Leon whether he would consider helping the co-op inventory abandoned planter units on a back lot they had been meaning to send to scrap. Leon agreed if Matt could come too. They spent a Saturday cataloging every salvageable casting, mount, chain assembly, shaft, meter body, and transmission cover still holding useful geometry. Russ walked with them taking notes and occasionally saying the kinds of things men say when a whole category of pride has quietly failed under them. Never figured we'd need any of this. Leon kept sorting. Need has bad timing, he said. By harvest the story had hardened into county memory. Brett Simons told it differently than he would have liked, which is to say honestly. Jared Phelps told people half his bean acres were planted on time because Leon Dwyer had one tagged casting on a shelf where everyone else had only opinions. Russ Hovell, astonishingly, told a winter meeting that the county ought to think harder about salvage capacity and local repair knowledge because resilience doesn't always come in a new box. That line got written down by a few people because it sounded like something bigger than machinery, and maybe it was. The next year, with the factory still tied up in court and pieces of its line being bought by different interests, Pawnee County behaved differently. A few operators switched brands where they could. Others formed informal parts pools. The co-op created a use component inventory board. Matt helped Leon organize donor units by compatibility rather than just by model year. 3 younger farmers who had spent half their lives outsourcing thought to catalogs started coming by the shed on winter evenings to learn how to identify where that mattered from where that merely looked expensive. Leon taught them without speeches. He showed them crack paths. Misalignment marks. Polish on shafts. Where castings fail because of design and where they fail because operators tighten things like anger can substitute for engineering. One night that winter, after the others had left and the shed had gone quiet except for the heater ticking as it cooled, Matt asked Leon whether he'd always known this would happen. Leon was cleaning a pivot pin with emery cloth. He thought for a while before answering. No, he said. I just knew factories don't care about your planting window. Matt nodded. Leon kept talking. People get too used to buying certainty. Then they forget certainty's just another part somebody else made. That was the lesson, or close to it. Not that every farmer should become a hoarder. Not that factories are wicked. Not even that the old ways are always superior. The lesson was that a community which laughs at saved knowledge because present systems feel smooth is really laughing at its own backup plan. Leon had not saved broken parts because he hated progress. He saved them because he understood that progress which cannot survive interruption is just convenience wearing expensive clothes. And when interruption finally arrived, the county discovered that convenience is a poor mechanic. Years later, after the original factory name had mostly disappeared and newer equipment had begun replacing some of the orphan planters across Kansas, Leon's salvage shed was still there. Cleaner than before, larger in one bay, and less mocked. Brett Simon sent his son over one winter to learn bushing work. Russ Hovell still told the story at meetings whenever someone started speaking too confidently about permanent supply. Matt took over more of the organizing and added a notebook system on a shelf by the door that cross-referenced donor parts across model families. Leon pretended not to care about the respect this earned, but he kept the notebooks dry and up to date. And in Pawnee County, if anyone ever laughed at a man for saving broken parts again, they did it more carefully than before. Because everybody remembered the spring when the co-op laughed at Leon Dwyer's salvage shed. Then the factory closed without warning. And all at once, the county discovered that the difference between junk and survival is often just whether somebody wise enough kept it.